this morning, just after sunrise, the man suspected of brutally killing 36 women met the long, drawn-out demands of justice. Bundy was executed before an atmosphere that was almost circus-like.
In prison for a long time now, and I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me, and without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question.
He was a law student with a brilliant future. He was a crisis hotline volunteer who spent his nights saving lives. He was even a personal friend to the very police officers hunting a monster. In fact, Ted Bundy was so normal that when a witness described a killer named Ted driving a tan Volkswagen, his own inner circle laughed it off as a joke. But while the world saw a charming neighbor, the shadows saw a predator, perfecting a method of abduction so cold, so calculated, it would claim 30 lives across 7 different states. This is the story of how the ultimate boy next door became America's most terrifying shadow, and how he used the truth to tell the ultimate lie. Today, we're peeling back the mask to uncover the brutal reality of his crimes, the strange truth behind his final meal, and the chilling final words he spoke just seconds before the curtain closed. To understand how the charming shadow was born, we have to go back to Seattle. It's 1974. Young women are vanishing from college campuses without a trace. No struggle, no witnesses, just empty dorm rooms. The police were looking for a monster, a deviant, someone who looked like a villain. What they didn't realize was that the man they were looking for was currently sitting in a psychology classroom, earning top grades and volunteering his time to talk people out of suicide. This was Bundy's greatest weapon, the mask of sanity. He didn't just hide from the law, he lived alongside it. He used his intelligence to study the very systems designed to catch him. While the public lived in fear of a stranger in the dark, they were opening their doors to the man with the perfect smile. Every monster has a beginning, but Ted Bundy's started with a lie so deep it would eventually fracture his entire reality. He wasn't born a Bundy. He was born Theodore Robert Cowell in a home for unwed mothers, a place of shame in 1946. For the first years of his life, Ted lived in a house built on a total fabrication. He was told that his mother, Louise, was actually his sister. He was led to believe his grandparents were his parents. Imagine the psychological toll. The person he looked to for sisterly fun was the mother who gave him life, and the man he called father, his grandfather Sam, was a man with a raging temper and a history of violence. The identity of his biological father remains one of the great mysteries of true crime. While DNA has since debunked the most extreme theories, the void where a father should have been left a hole in Ted that he would eventually try to fill with power and control. When Louise finally moved him to Tacoma and married Johnny Bundy, the lie didn't just go away, it evolved. The boy next door realized his entire life was a script written by people he couldn't trust. Some say this was the moment the mask of sanity began to form. If his own family could lie so perfectly, why couldn't he? He didn't just learn to charm, he learned to manipulate. He realized that if you look the part and play the role, the world will believe whatever story you tell them. The transition from a fractured childhood to a calculated predator didn't happen overnight. It began with an eerie, unconfirmed shadow. Long before the official body count started in 1974, a chilling incident occurred in Tacoma, Washington, that many investigators believe was Bundy's true initiation. It was 1961. Anne Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl with a bright smile, vanished from her bedroom in the middle of a stormy night. There was no sign of a struggle, only an open window and a void that remains unfilled to this day. We can't prove he was there with DNA or fingerprints, but the kid lived right around the corner. Plus, the way the girl was snatched from her own bed was so bold and calculated, it looks exactly like the work he'd become famous for years later. Lead detective Robert Keppel, who spent years interviewing Bundy on death row, eventually linked him to this case because it perfectly matches his signature, targeting victims in domestic settings and making the bodies vanish completely. To experts like Keppel, this method of operation is as unique as a fingerprint. As he entered his 20s, the internal pressure cooker of rejection and identity crisis began to boil over. Ted was obsessed with high society living, but lacked the pedigree to match his ambitions. When his first serious girlfriend, a wealthy socialite, ended their relationship, the rejection didn't just hurt, it catalyzed a metamorphosis. He didn't just want her back, he wanted to become the kind of man who could never be discarded again. He re-engineered his personality, diving into politics and law, building a facade so thick that even those closest to him couldn't see the darkening rot underneath. By the early 1970s, the mask of sanity was fully operational. He began frequenting the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, not as a student, but as a hunter. This period marked the shift from voyeurism to physical violence. He began testing the waters of abduction, learning how to lure victims using feigned injuries and authoritative personas. This was the quiet before the storm, the moment the boy next door officially died, and the Phantom began his reign. By early 1974, the Phantom persona became a physical reality across Washington state. The quiet collegiate atmosphere of the University of Washington shattered on February 1st when Linda Ann Healy vanished from her off-campus basement bedroom. The scene left behind was a haunting contradiction of the Bundy method. A bed meticulously made, yet a single bloodstain on the pillow spoke of a violent struggle hidden under the guise of order. This wasn't a random act. It was the work of someone who understood the architecture of college life, moving through the halls like a shadow. The spring and summer of that year turned the Pacific Northwest into a hunting ground. Women were disappearing at an alarming rate, one nearly every month. But the terror reached a fever pitch on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park. In broad daylight, amid thousands of picnickers, a handsome man with his arm in a sling approached Janice Ott. He played the part of the helpless, injured stranger asking for assistance with a sailboat atop his tan Volkswagen Beetle. She agreed to help, walking away toward the parking lot, never to be seen alive again. Only 4 hours later, he returned to the same beach, using the same broken arm ruse to lure Denise Naslund. By the time their remains were discovered on Taylor Mountain months later, the tally had grown. The signature was clear: attractive victims with long hair parted down the middle, lured by a man who weaponized empathy. The police had a name, Ted, and a vehicle description, but they were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility that a local law student could be responsible for such savage escalation. This trail of blood wasn't just a series of murders, it was a geography of missed opportunities. By 1975, the geographic focus shifted from Washington to the rugged landscapes of Utah and Colorado. The charming Shadow had relocated to Salt Lake City, ostensibly to attend law school, but his arrival coincided with a horrific surge in local disappearances. The mask finally slipped in August when a patrol officer noticed a tan Volkswagen idling in a dark residential neighborhood. Inside the vehicle, police discovered a toolkit of nightmares: a ski mask, handcuffs, and a crowbar. This initial arrest triggered a chain reaction that led to his first conviction for the kidnapping of Carol DeRanch. Yet the prison walls in Colorado could not contain a predator who viewed the legal system as a puzzle rather than a punishment. His first defiance of gravity occurred in June 1977 during a preliminary hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse. Exploiting his status as his own legal counsel, he was granted access to the law library without shackles. When the guards looked away, he leapt from a second-story window, vanishing into the aspen wilderness for 6 days before his recapture. However, his most audacious feat was yet to come. On New Year's Eve, he carved a hole through the ceiling of his cell, squeezed his emaciated frame through the crawl space, and walked out of the front door of the Garfield County Jail. This second escape proved catastrophic. While the authorities searched the snowy mountains, the Phantom had already boarded a bus, eventually reaching Tallahassee, Florida. Thousands of miles away from the investigators who knew his name, he was a ghost once again. He moved into a rooming house under a false identity, blending into the vibrant energy of a college town. The authorities in the West were left chasing a memory, unaware that the most violent chapter of his campaign was about to be written on the floor of a sorority house. Florida was supposed to be a refuge from justice, but it became a theater for Bundy's most depraved escalation. Living under the alias Chris Hagen, he occupied a cramped boarding house blocks away from Florida State University. The restraint he had practiced for years finally snapped on the night of January 14, 1978. In less than 15 minutes, he infiltrated the Chi Omega sorority house, moving silently through the corridors like a ghost. Armed with a heavy oak log, he unleashed a blitz attack that left 2 young women dead and 2 others permanently scarred. The brutality was unprecedented. Forensic teams would later testify that the violence shifted from mere abduction to a frenzied, chaotic rage. Before the campus could even process the horror, the predator struck again. Just blocks away, he entered another apartment, viciously assaulting a 5th victim before vanishing into the humid night. The city was paralyzed by a fear that had no name. Yet the monster's appetite was not satisfied. Weeks later, in Lake City, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was led away from her school in broad daylight. She would be his final victim. The charming shadow had become reckless, leaving behind a trail of physical evidence and eyewitness accounts that even his polished facade could no longer explain away. The end came during a routine traffic stop in Pensacola. Driving a stolen vehicle, Bundy was pulled over by an officer who noticed his erratic behavior. After a violent struggle on the pavement, the man who had escaped twice was finally in permanent custody. The mask was ripped away for the last time. As investigators from across the country converged on Florida, they realized the law student they once laughed about was the most prolific predator in American history. The legal proceedings that followed in 1979 were less a trial and more a macabre piece of performance art. Held in Miami, the Chi Omega case became the first televised murder trial in American history, transforming the courtroom into a global stage. Bundy, ever the narcissist, made the fateful decision to act as his own lead attorney. He believed his law school training and natural charisma would allow him to outmaneuver the prosecution, but his arrogance blinded him to the mounting physical evidence. Dressed in sharp suits and flashing his trademark smile, he cross-examined witnesses with a chilling detachment, treating the investigation into his own depravity as a mere intellectual exercise for the cameras. The turning point came with the introduction of forensic odontology. While Bundy successfully challenged several eyewitness accounts, he could not explain away the physical impressions found on a victim's body. Dr. Richard Souveron testified that the unique alignment of Bundy's teeth perfectly matched the bite marks left at the crime scene. It was a landmark moment for forensic science. The mask of sanity was finally cracked by a piece of evidence as permanent as a fingerprint. Despite his theatrical objections and frantic motions to suppress testimony, the jury saw through the charade. The image of the charming student evaporated, replaced by the reality of a calculating butcher. After less than 7 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Judge Edward Cowart, while handing down the death sentence, remarked that the crimes were extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. He famously told Bundy to take care of yourself, a final irony in a case defined by the contrast between public civility and private horror. The shadow was finally cornered, but the journey to the electric chair would take another decade of legal maneuvers. While the state of Florida moved to execute him, Ted Bundy was busy orchestrating a legal circus that remains unparalleled in American history. Amidst the grim testimony of the 1980 Kimberly Leach trial, he weaponized an obscure legal loophole. Florida law suggested that an oral declaration of marriage made in open court before a presiding judge was legally binding. On February 9, 1980, the defendant became a groom. He called his longtime loyalist, Carol Ann Boone, to the stand under the guise of character testimony. With cameras rolling and the jury in stunned silence, the predator executed his most audacious stunt yet. During his questioning, he pivoted from legal defense to a formal proposal. When Carol accepted, he declared them married on the spot. It was a calculated move designed to humanize a monster and shock the prosecution. This wasn't merely about affection, it was a tactical maneuver to gain marital privileges and manipulate public perception. The judge, though visibly irritated, had to acknowledge the legality of the union. For years, this marriage became a cornerstone of his life behind bars, even resulting in the birth of a daughter, Rose, who was conceived during illicit contact on death row. However, this bond was built on the same shifting sand as his mask of sanity. As the execution date approached and the weight of his confessions finally became undeniable, the loyalty of his wife evaporated. Carol eventually realized that the man she protected was a hollow shell of lies. She divorced him in 1986, taking their child and vanishing into obscurity. The courtroom wedding was not a beginning, but a final desperate performance before the curtain fell. For 9 years, Ted Bundy occupied a cell at Florida State Prison, weaponizing the legal system to delay his inevitable encounter with Old Sparky, the state's electric chair. He was a master of the stall, filing endless appeals and maintaining a staunch veneer of innocence that captivated a morbidly curious public. However, as 1989 dawned and his final death warrant was signed, the facade finally crumbled. Realizing that his life was no longer a negotiable asset, the narcissist pivoted to a new strategy: the trade. In a desperate bid for a stay of execution, he began a series of exhaustive interviews with investigators, finally pulling back the curtain on a decade of darkness. These death row confessions were a chilling map of a cross-country slaughter. Bundy began naming victims that had long been cold cases, detailing the locations of dump sites on Taylor Mountain and in the Utah desert with clinical precision. He described his entity, a malignant internal force that drove his compulsions, attempting to frame his depravity as a psychological phenomenon rather than a moral choice. He sat with agents like Bill Hagmaier of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, providing the very data that would help refine the art of criminal profiling. It was a final, twisted attempt to remain relevant, ensuring his legacy would be studied by the very people who hunted him. Despite the wealth of new information, the state of Florida remained unmoved. The charming Shadow had run out of time and tricks. On his final night, he bypassed the opportunity for a curated last meal, opting instead for the standard prison fare he would never eat. As he prepared for the end, he sat for a final interview with James Dobson, notoriously blaming the media for his descent into violence. It was his last performance, a final mask donned to deflect the blame for 30 lives stolen. The morning of January 24, 1989, arrived with a cold, clinical finality. Outside the walls of Florida State Prison, a carnival-like atmosphere had taken hold, with hundreds of people gathered to cheer for the impending execution. Inside, the man who had spent decades manipulating the perceptions of others was finally out of maneuvers. Following the strict protocol of the Death Watch, Bundy was offered the traditional privilege of a requested final meal. In a rare moment of total surrender, or perhaps a final act of cold defiance, he declined to choose. Consequently, he was served the standard Florida state menu for the condemned: a medium rare steak, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk and juice. He never touched a single bite. As the clock struck 7 a.m., Bundy was led into the execution chamber. The charming Shadow appeared pale and spent, the vibrant charisma that had once dazzled courtrooms having vanished entirely. He was strapped into the heavy oak chair, his head shaved and prepared for the electrodes. When asked if he had any last words, he looked toward his attorney and a minister, his voice steady but low. He whispered, "Give my love to my family and friends." It was a hauntingly normal statement from a man whose life had been anything but. At 7:06 a.m., the current was applied. The man who had taken at least 30 lives was pronounced dead minutes later, bringing a close to one of the darkest chapters in American history. While the crowd outside erupted in celebration, the investigators left behind were faced with a chilling reality. The mask had finally fallen, but the true depth of his depravity would remain a permanent shadow over the landscape of justice. The death of Ted Bundy did not end the fascination with his crimes. Instead, it birthed a new era of criminal psychology and media obsession. He became the definitive blueprint for the modern serial killer, the organized predator who blends seamlessly into professional society. His case forced the FBI to revolutionize its behavioral science unit, using the insights gleaned from his final confessions to build the VICAP database. This system allowed law enforcement to track patterns across state lines, ensuring that a killer could no longer disappear into the geographic gaps that Bundy so expertly exploited during his cross-country rampage. Beyond the forensic impact, the Bundy effect fundamentally changed how the public perceives safety and charm. The realization that a law student, a political aide, and a trusted friend could be capable of such profound depravity shattered the stranger danger myths of the mid-20th century. He proved that the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the woods, they sit next to you in the library. This psychological shift gave rise to the true crime genre as we know it, fueling a billion-dollar industry of documentaries, podcasts, and films that continue to analyze every fracture in his Mask of Sanity. Ultimately, the legacy of the charming Shadow is one of profound loss and permanent vigilance. While the media often focuses on his charisma, the true story remains with the 30 lives he extinguished and the families left in the wake of his vanity. As forensic science evolves with DNA and digital tracking, the methods Bundy used have become relics of a less connected age. However, the lesson he left behind remains chillingly relevant. The most terrifying darkness is often the one that wears a familiar, smiling face. The mask may have fallen, but the shadow remains.